The cell is dark. The air is wet, clinging to your skin like cold sweat. Somewhere in the blackness, a chain rattles. You're not sure if it's the prisoner in the corner, or the rat dragging away someone's finger. You've been here for 3 days, but already you understand why people say it's better to face the executioner's axe than to rot in this place. In the medieval world, there were prisons so cruel, so unrelenting, that death wasn't the punishment, it was the mercy. When we picture medieval justice, our minds jump to gallows, public beheadings, or the Iron Maiden. But in reality, prison wasn't the punishment, it was the waiting room before the punishment. In the Middle Ages, prisons weren't built to keep you for years. They were holding pits, designed to strip away dignity, hope, and humanity before the real sentence was carried out. The earliest medieval prisons often grew out of castle dungeons and city gatehouses. These weren't purpose-built facilities, they were damp, cramped basements or unused storerooms hastily converted to hold the accused. The idea of doing time simply didn't exist. A thief might spend 2 weeks in a cell before being flogged and released, while a political prisoner might languish for months before a public execution. The cell was just a place to rot until someone decided your fate. And yet, for certain people, this limbo became a fate worse than death. You see, medieval Europe was deeply religious, and punishment was as much about your soul as your body. Death by execution could be spun as a chance for repentance, a final confession before meeting God. Prison, however, left you in spiritual decay, cut off from light, warmth, and human kindness. Some rulers understood the psychological cruelty of this all too well. King Edward I of England famously ordered that political prisoners be kept in such straitness that they perish. It was a form of slow killing without the spectacle, a way to erase someone from the world quietly. As the centuries passed, dedicated prison structures did emerge like London's Newgate prison, but they retained the same brutal philosophy. They weren't places of reform. They were places to break the will, so that when your day of judgment came, you faced it not as a man, but as something hollowed out. This was the birth of the medieval prison, not a system of justice, but a tool of despair. And once you stepped inside, the question wasn't how long you'd stay. It was whether you'd still be human when you left, if you left at all. The blueprint for many medieval prisons came directly from the feudal mindset. The Lord's word was law, and punishment served as both vengeance and warning. Castles became centers of this authority. In their lowest levels, the damp, windowless undercrofts were perfect for holding those who crossed the wrong person. These spaces weren't designed with comfort, safety, or even basic survival in mind. The walls dripped with groundwater. The only ventilation came from gaps in the stone, which in winter brought in freezing drafts, and in summer trapped suffocating heat. Prisoners often sat chained to the wall, unable to fully stand or lie down. In many cells, the floor was nothing but packed dirt or cold stone, slick with mold. And if you were unlucky enough to be thrown into an oubliette, a pit dungeon, accessible only from a hatch above, there was no floor at all, just a narrow space where you'd stand. For hours, days, or weeks, your legs swelling and your muscles failing. Food was rarely brought on any regular schedule. Guards tossed in scraps, sometimes literally throwing them onto the filthy ground for prisoners to fight over. For drinking water, you might rely on rain dripping through cracks in the ceiling, or a shared bucket that doubled as a latrine. Disease spread quickly in these conditions, and if one prisoner caught something like dysentery or the plague, it could wipe out an entire dungeon within days. But perhaps the most devastating element wasn't the physical hardship, it was the deliberate isolation. Many medieval jailers understood that silence and darkness could shatter a mind faster than the whip. Prisoners reported losing all sense of time, unable to tell if they had been inside for days or months. Without light, the brain starts to create its own hallucinations that blur the line between nightmare and waking life. In such places, the walls didn't just contain you. They consumed you, piece by piece, until even the thought of public execution seemed like a mercy worth begging for. While medieval prisons were brutal, they weren't all the same, and the differences often depended on who you were. For the poorest peasants, a prison cell might be nothing more than a shared hole in the ground, with a crude wooden grate to stop escapes. for nobles or wealthy merchants. Imprisonment could take place in a guarded chamber with a bed, a fireplace, and the possibility of outside food deliveries, though even these luxuries were meant to humiliate by stripping away freedom. Political prisoners often faced a different sort of cruelty. Not neglect, but intentional torment in some cases. Captors would deliberately keep them alive in terrible conditions for years, hoping to break their will or extract confessions. Famous figures like Roger Mortimer, the first Earl of March, endured long periods in medieval captivity before meeting their executioner. The suffering wasn't just physical. It was designed to turn them into examples for anyone daring to challenge authority. Church prisons added their own grim twist, run by religious orders or the Inquisition. These cells blended physical discomfort with spiritual pressure. Prisoners might be kept in darkness, forced to fast, or subjected to endless sermons meant to save their souls. Some inquisitors used these prisons not to kill, but to reform through fear so profound that prisoners left convinced eternal damnation was worse than the cell. And yet, despite the cruelty, there was no organized system for prisons across Europe. Some towns kept small lockups for thieves and debtors, others relied on castle dungeons or even monasteries. This lack of standardization meant you could be thrown into a relatively mild guardhouse in one city or a death pit in another. Still, one thing was consistent: prisons weren't meant to fix you. They weren't meant to hold you indefinitely. They were meant to soften you up for whatever came next, be it public shaming, mutilation, or the headsman's axe. And as the centuries rolled on, these places of despair became more than just waiting rooms for death. They became death sentences in disguise. Imagine waking up in complete darkness, not the soft, comforting black of sleep, but a thick, oppressive void that presses against your skin. In medieval prisons, this was reality. There were no windows, no clocks, no sunlight. Time had no meaning. You could be here for hours or years. The first horror was the environment itself: wet stone walls that leached cold into your bones, floors slick with mold, and the ever-present stench of human waste mingling with the rotting remains of past prisoners. Hunger became another enemy. Meals were sparse, meager, and often thrown directly onto the dirt floor. Rats and vermin were just as hungry, and they didn't wait their turn. Prisoners reported waking to discover fingers bitten, food stolen, or even limbs nibbled by rodents. Thirst was equally cruel. The water you were given was often foul, stagnant, or shared among dozens of prisoners in a single bucket. One wrong sip could bring sickness. One night of dehydration could push a weak body to the edge of madness. Then there was the noise, or more accurately, the lack of comforting sounds. Outside, life continued. Birds chirped, bells tolled, merchants shouted. Inside, there was only silence and the occasional echo of distant screams. Guards rarely spoke unless it was to punish. Even the faintest sound of scurrying rat, the drip of water, or the grinding of chains became amplified, twisting in your mind until reality itself felt like a nightmare. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect wasn't physical at all. It was the mental erosion. Prisoners began to hallucinate, talking to shadows or imagining their loved ones in distress. Some lost the ability to distinguish between day and night. Others, staring into endless blackness, simply stopped hoping. The cell wasn't just a room. It was a machine designed to destroy your sense of self, leaving you desperate, terrified, and longing for an escape that might only come through death. Beyond the darkness and filth, medieval prisons introduced horrors that were uniquely human. Guards were often as cruel as the cells themselves, taking perverse pleasure in tormenting prisoners. Some would yank chains to make you fall. Others would throw insults so vicious they broke your spirit before your body. In certain dungeons, there were punishments specifically designed to terrify without killing. A sudden drop into freezing water, the sting of hot irons, or being left alone in a pit full of rats. The infamous oubliettes exemplified the extreme. These vertical shaft-like cells were only accessible from a hatch above. Once a prisoner was dropped inside, they might never see another soul. Food was lowered irregularly, sometimes forgotten entirely. Many prisoners died of starvation or exposure long before anyone remembered them. Guards didn't need to be executioners. The prison itself did the work. Disease spread like wildfire, lice, fleas, and rats carried fevers and infections, while cramped conditions ensured that sickness passed quickly from one prisoner to the next. Dysentery, scurvy, and plague were not uncommon, making survival a matter of luck as much as endurance. The stench of death was constant. Sometimes, bodies were left to rot in the corners, a grim reminder of what awaited anyone too weak to endure. Yet amid this horror, stories survive of prisoners who clung to sanity through cunning, faith, or sheer stubbornness. Some memorized prayers, repeated them tirelessly, or traced stories into the stone walls. Others used small acts of defiance, sabotaging guards, hiding scraps of food, or communicating secretly with the outside world to maintain a fragile sense of agency. It was these flickers of humanity that illustrate just how cruelly the environment was designed to crush them. Every act of life, however small, was a rebellion against the dungeon's relentless despair. By the end of each day, or rather, each endless succession of days, prisoners were shadows of themselves. The prison was no longer a place to be held. It had become a predator, consuming bodies, minds, and hope, turning the living into a state worse than death. Some of the most infamous medieval prisons were more than mere holding cells. They were instruments of terror and spectacle. Take London's Newgate Prison, for example. By the 14th century, it had become synonymous with overcrowding, disease, and despair. Prisoners were crammed into tiny spaces, often chained together, with barely room to sit or lie down. The stench of sweat, rot, and human excrement hung in the air like a permanent fog. Those fortunate enough to survive the conditions often emerged mentally broken, their bodies a map of scars, from both disease and abuse. Then there were the castle dungeons of France and Germany, where political prisoners were kept in luxurious misery. Wealth or rank didn't save you from isolation, starvation, or psychological torment. Some captives were allowed furniture or food, but only as a cruel means of comparison, seeing another as comfort. While remaining trapped drove many to madness, the goal wasn't just to punish, it was to demonstrate power, both to the prisoner and to the world beyond the walls. And yet, the most horrifying aspect of these prisons wasn't always visible. It was the uncertainty. Prisoners never knew if they would be executed tomorrow, left to rot indefinitely, or briefly released only to face harsher punishment later. This unpredictability created a constant state of fear, a mental torture as cruel as any physical abuse. Many preferred the certainty of the executioner's blade over the endless ambiguity of dungeon life. Even stories that reached outside the prison walls carried their own terror. Families and neighbors knew that being accused could mean years of suffering, chained in darkness. Hungry, beaten, and ignored, the medieval prison became a tool not only of punishment, but of social control, teaching communities the cost of dissent and the fragility of human dignity. By the time one left the prison, if they survived, it was often only through death or miraculous release. Few returned whole, and those who did were haunted for life. These cells were designed to break every part of you, and for many, the only relief came when they begged for the ultimate escape, execution. For most modern minds, the idea of wanting execution seems unthinkable, and yet, in the grim reality of medieval prisons, death was often the only mercy a person could hope for. After weeks or months in darkness, starved, infested, and broken, prisoners began to see the gallows, the axe, or the fire as an escape from a living nightmare. It wasn't a cowardice, it was a rational choice when the alternative was the slow erosion of body and soul. Psychologists today might call it learned helplessness. The prisoner's environment was crafted to strip them of control. No food schedules, no sunlight, constant chains, and the ever-present threat of disease or abuse. Each day was a repetition of pain and uncertainty, with no hope for relief. Over time, this forced them to focus on one certainty: death, when it finally arrived, would be quick compared to the endless torment of confinement. Some prisoners went further, actively seeking death. Stories survive of men and women begging guards for a sword, a noose, or a dagger. Others attempted daring escapes, not because they wanted freedom, but because the attempt might provoke execution and end their suffering on their own terms. Medieval jailers sometimes complied, recognizing the psychological toll on captives and even the potential to cleanse a dungeon without extra effort. Execution in this context became more than punishment, it became a form of control over one's fate. The gallows or axe was a grim agency, the final decision that the prisoner could make for themselves in a world designed to remove all other choices. And in some cases, these deaths were public, turning the individual's relief into a spectacle that reinforced fear throughout the community. See what happens when someone loses all hope, and remember the power of the law. The intertwining of despair, mortality, and authority created a paradoxical truth in the Middle Ages. Some prisoners literally prayed for the executioner not as a curse, but as a blessing that finally ended the unbearable nightmare inside those walls. The decision to choose death over life in prison wasn't made lightly. Medieval prisoners had a deep understanding of what the cells could do to the mind and body. Days blurred into nights, and nights into weeks, with little distinction or comfort. Hunger gnawed constantly, and the damp, cold air made every breath a struggle. Illness and injury were inevitable, yet medical care was non-existent. In many ways, prisoners were left to endure suffering designed to crush hope itself. In some prisons, certain tactics were deliberately psychological. Guards would leave prisoners in pitch-black cells for months, whispering threats of torture or execution that might never come or might come at any moment. Isolation broke the strongest wills. Many accounts describe prisoners talking to shadows, imagining conversations with dead loved ones, or believing they saw visions of demons. The mind, starved for stimuli, began to turn against itself. The body could endure only so much before the mind demanded an end. Some prisoners tried to manipulate the system to achieve that end. Letters smuggled out requested that guards do what must be done, and in certain jurisdictions, authorities allowed a form of assisted death to relieve particularly stubborn or dangerous captives. Others, realizing the futility of resistance, acted with desperation, refusing food, injuring themselves, or provoking guards in the hope of being executed. In these extreme cases, the executioner became an agent of salvation rather than punishment, a cruel inversion. That highlights the medieval psyche toward punishment and control. Even outside the cell, society reinforced the notion that death was preferable to enduring prison. Tales of infamous dungeons, London's Newgate, French oubliettes, and German castle pits spread fear, making it clear that no one, regardless of rank, could escape the slow torture within. And yet, the same stories also offered a twisted kind of hope. If you couldn't survive the dungeon, the executioner might grant you mercy, sparing you weeks or months of torment. The medieval prisoner's choice was grimly logical. When faced with a living death designed to destroy body and soul, asking for the final release of execution wasn't to surrender, it was the only way to reclaim agency in a world that had systematically stripped it away. By the time a prisoner reached the final moments, the desire for death had often become overwhelming. Stories from medieval records describe men and women begging for the axe, the noose, or even poison, seeing them not as instruments of punishment, but as deliverance. Execution offered a certainty that prison could not, a defined end, a relief from the endless terror, and, in some cases, a chance to die with dignity rather than rot away in darkness. Some accounts are almost unimaginable. Prisoners would bargain for the timing of their death, writing letters or appealing to sympathetic guards. In rare instances, they were granted privileges like a clean cell, a moment with family, or a final confession, gestures that highlight the strange morality of the time. Death was both punishment and mercy, and the line between the two was determined not by justice, but by circumstance and endurance. The psychological toll of long-term imprisonment also shaped society's perception of power and fear. Lords and monarchs knew that the threat of a dreaded prison could control behavior without bloodshed, yet the inevitability of death for many prisoners reinforced a terrifying truth. The medieval prison didn't merely punish crime, it punished humanity itself. People were broken physically, mentally, and emotionally, until the executioner became a symbol of salvation rather than judgment. And yet, amid this horror, some prisoners left behind tales of resilience. A few survived years in dungeons, emerging with stories that shocked the outside world. These accounts often emphasize the thin line between life and death, sanity and madness, despair and hope. They remind us that the medieval prison was more than a place of confinement. It was a mirror to society's darkest fears, a testament to human cruelty, and a grim lesson on the limits of endurance. In the end, medieval prisons were so horrifying that death wasn't a punishment, it was the mercy everyone longed for. For those trapped behind stone walls and iron bars, the gallows were not a fate to dread, but a release to pray for. And as we look back, we realize that the darkest prisons of the Middle Ages were not just holding cells, they were arenas of suffering that tested the very essence of what it meant to be human. The medieval prison was more than a building of stone and iron. It was a crucible of fear, despair, and unimaginable suffering for centuries. These dungeons and oubliettes stripped prisoners of hope, of light, of dignity, and sometimes even of sanity. The horrors inside were designed not merely to punish, but to break the human spirit completely, so that death became release rather than a punishment. We've explored the birth of these prisons, the daily torment endured by those trapped within their walls, and the chilling reality that, for many, the only salvation was the executioner's blade. It's a stark reminder that in history, punishment was often less about justice and more about power, the power to instill terror, to enforce obedience, and to remind society of the consequences of crossing authority. And yet, amid the darkness, we also glimpsed human resilience. Prisoners clung to prayer, memory, and fleeting acts of defiance. Even in conditions designed to crush them entirely, some survived, telling stories that echo across centuries, giving us insight into a world so alien, so brutal, that it challenges our understanding of endurance and despair. Thinking about these forgotten corners of history makes us reflect how much of human cruelty is intentional and how much is a consequence of indifference. How does fear shape societies? And what lessons can we take from the past to better understand the fragility and strength of the human spirit? If you found yourself shocked, horrified, or even a little fascinated by what life or death behind medieval prison walls was really like, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel to explore more forgotten, dark, and twisted corners of history. Hit the bell to never miss a story that will challenge what you think you know about the past. And share this video because some of history's most chilling truths are too important, too fascinating, to remain in the shadows. The medieval prison may have been a place where hope went to die, but today, through these stories, it comes alive again, teaching us, terrifying us, and reminding us of the extremes humanity is capable of.